what is perhaps more surprising is how this has escalated.
We still have the tech spending. We're still going to get fiscal initiatives coming through.
Then the question will be, what are the longer term implications of this?
I've spoken many times about the vulnerability from an economic perspective that Europe has.
Not sure I really understand the drivers behind US intervention. It's affordability, it's migration, and it's security.
Welcome to another edition of What's Brewing with Matt and Guy. Now Matt, last time we spoke it was the start of the year. There was great hope about what was going to happen. At the same time, we had the Monroe Doctrine, or the Donroe Doctrine, being much spoken about. We had the intervention, of course, in Venezuela. There was talk about, US territory, security, all of these things. Is the Middle East now part of that Donroe Doctrine? How do you see it?
That's a good question. Yes, have we expanded the Western Hemisphere to cover the Gulf? It starts to look that way, although to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure I really understand the drivers behind US intervention in the
I'm not sure anybody does. That's what worries me.
Well, I thought we'd seen an end to forever wars, but seemingly there's room for one last hurrah before exit. Look, it had been brewing for a while. I don't think anyone was surprised that frictions between Israel and Iran and the US bubbled over again.
No.
I think what is perhaps more surprising is how this has escalated. And what is particularly worrying is the challenges in seeing a path to a stable ceasefire going forward. But look, hopefully that can be breached. We've had positive signals recently, and then the question will be, what are the longer term implications of this? Has it derailed the fairly positive view of economic growth that you outlined a couple of months ago when we caught up, or are you still positive about the prospects for 2026?
Well, look, firstly, I'm not sure it should be a surprise to anybody that anything in the Middle East is never an easy solution. There's never an easy exit. And I think you're right. I mean, at the beginning of the year, we had quite an upbeat look on the world. We had global growth kind of trend-like. We had three key drivers to support that. One was, of course, the capital spending boom that we felt was going to continue. The other one, of course, was the fiscal initiatives coming from China, Japan, of course, Germany, and the big, beautiful bill in the US. And we also had further interest rate cuts penciled in. So that general dynamic for growth was actually quite a good one. Now, the important point from my side is that two of them are still there. We still have the tech spending. We're still going to get fiscal initiatives coming through. The one that's...
And you don't think those fiscal initiatives are going to be stymied by inflation, by increased costs?
No, I think they're still going to be there. Could some of it be spent on caps or some energy subsidies? Yes, I think some of that could be. But I think there is enough in the pipeline. And actually, we're beginning to see some of that come through, even in the case of Europe in terms of some of the spending and infrastructure. I think that comes through. The one that we don't have, however, is the cut in interest rates. I think the fact that we've got higher energy prices, higher input costs, is going to change the way the central banks operate. Now, market pricing, which we often look at, just a month ago, it would say that in the UK, for example, the Bank of England was going to cut rates 2 times this year. And as of yesterday morning, it moved from 2 cuts to 4 rate hikes. That's profound.
That's a handbrake turn, isn't it? I mean, this is extraordinary. You do ask questions about how accurate pricing is in the market. If they
market efficiency, we've always questioned a little bit, but it shows you that market opinion, that opinion generally can change very quickly around that. We probably think that's overdone. But the point about this issue in the Middle East is, you've often asked me, why is it that the financial markets continue to move ever higher, given everything that we saw in 2025? And my answer was generally because it doesn't impact corporate margins or revenue. This time it's different. This time it is going to impact both of those.
So there's real economy impact from what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. I think there are also going to be political implications of that. So if I mirror your, 3 areas of sort of positive drivers for growth, the sort of 3 areas of political pain that I see certainly landing in Europe and North America over coming months, it's affordability, it's migration, and it's security. And all of those pose particular headaches for sitting governments and shape a little bit the political discourse. And if we look first at the US, where obviously we've got very consequential midterm elections coming up in November.
But those 3 things that you pointed out, that was part of President Trump's manifesto, was it not? And all of those are looking a little bit shaky right now.
This is exactly the point, right? Is that he risks undermining the platform which so successfully put him into his second term last year. So if we look at the affordability piece, gas prices, a bit like mortgage rates in the UK. I mean, there's sort of only one thing faster than light in the universe, and it's the reaction of US voters to higher gas prices, because it hits the pocket immediately. So affordability, I think, is going to be an additional headwind. It's going to be a problem, and you see that feeding through already, I think, into some of the approval
Democrats
ratings.
have also made that very much a focal point. That's what they see, I think, as the Achilles heel in the current administration.
100%, and whether that's at the sort of federal level or whether that's in sort of state level races, you see it come through, and that will be the battleground going into the midterms, I'm sure.
So how will that look? I mean, are the Democrats likely to win? I guess the Senate is out of the question pretty much, but they're likely to win the House.
As polling stands, yes, you assume that the House of Representatives flips. Senate is a very big reach for the Democrats. It may come into play, but I think you'd need to get closer to the election to be confident at all about calling that. But it will still cause headaches for President Trump.
But will he be a lame duck president? I can't imagine him gently sliding off into the sunset.
Well, this is it. It's difficult to see President Trump being lame duck, but certainly he will be constrained in what he can do through legislation, through Congress. So TBC, 27 will be more complicated from a domestic political perspective in the States.
Now, the US, though, has the benefit of being still in pretty good health economically. The dollar is still the reserve currency. Interest rates are still okay in the US. What about the other parts of the world? You mentioned Europe. We've got really important elections coming up in Europe. I've spoken many times about the vulnerability from an economic perspective that Europe has. How do you see things in Europe? And is it going to be, again, populist mandates that are very much front and foremost?
So it's fragmentation of politics and populism that's driving that, and that's the key political narrative, I think, across all of the major European member states and UK. Affordability is an issue in Europe as well, and that will come through increased gas prices and the costs of heating your house or the inputs to manufacturing, and that's particularly a headache for Germany. But alongside that, you've got the other two sort of areas of political pain, which is migration. And I think there is a real risk that the conflict in Iran leaves a very damaged, very broken state.
Yeah, it's not going to help that for
one
sure.
One that is likely to see increased migration flows out of Iran, and that's something that will hit Europe and will exacerbate existing political tensions. And then you've also got a renewed focus on the security headache. I mean, the US certainly does not look like the predictable ally with aligned interests of old. And I think anyone who was in a doubt after 2025 that President Trump was seeing things the same way that the government in Berlin or Paris or London did has been disabused of that. And that poses a challenge in terms of sort of strategic thinking about defence from a European perspective. But it also poses quite immediate, quite direct challenges in terms of where you spend the limited tax revenue that you've got left to play with. You've got to redeploy from welfare to security in a way you've not had to for 30 odd years.
But one thing, Matt, I mean, I get all of that, and of course there's risk, and of all these elections that are coming up, and yes, the political or the populist movements are still very much evident. I still see this as another opportunity, yet another opportunity that Europe has to do things better. I think it has become more unified over the years. I think back to the European crisis, a decade or so ago. So I'm encouraged in a way that all of this conflict, all of this strife, all of this challenge with the relationship with the United States, it does make Europe realize they have to look after themselves. They have to cooperate. They have to find good solutions, good platforms. They need to be more productive going forward, and they cannot rely on others to bail them out. That, to me, is not a bad thing.
So look, the incentives are clearly there, and this is well understood by the technocrats, the sort of traditional governing parties of Europe. I mean, look at the Draghi report. I mean, that very clearly set out the need for greater European cooperation, further advances on single market if you're going to deliver what European citizens want, which is economic growth, a better future than a past.
Well, let's hope they do that. But one thing, and I don't want to forget this because I get lots of questions on this, which is Asia. All the focus, of course, is in the Middle East. A lot of the key players, some very big players, have been very quiet given what's going on here. How do you see that? And to the question that nobody really kind of ever wants to address or answer, what does this mean about Taiwan, the situation that we're seeing, or the actions by the United States? Does that change the focus of the Chinese at all, or is it going to be business as usual?
Look, my take on this is that the Chinese are carefully planning their approach to how they reabsorb Taiwan over time, if they do, ultimately. But I would be very surprised if they're sort of opportunistic tactical land grab in the short term because some US carriers have been redeployed. Right. And this Chinese government focus on dominating key supply chains, key value chains, and making sure that they are fundamental to all aspects of the global economy. That will continue to create headaches for those countries that are having to compete with cheap Chinese exports that are delivering high quality goods right through the value chain these days. So that's a fundamental problem when you look at how the global economy is going to reach equilibrium going forward. I see nothing that changes that in the short term. I think that probably remains positive for those countries that are able to play into that Chinese value chain from ASEAN. It creates perhaps broader headaches for those of us in the West who, for a couple of hundred years, haven't had to think too hard about direct competition in economic terms from China or other large Asian markets.
Well, look, Matt, I don't think that's a bad place to end it. I think we would both agree what is critical, of course, is what happens in the Middle East in the coming days and weeks. And can we have a ceasefire? Can we have some exit plan put together? Because if we don't have that, I think both in your world from a geopolitical side and from my side on the economics, I think it's going to be a much harder year ahead of us were that not.
The question will be the stability of a conclusion. I think there's no doubt that ultimately there will be a ceasefire, that both sides will want to de-escalate. But is that going to be stable, or are we going to have to recalibrate a level of risk around the Middle East, around GCC, Saudi, Iran for the longer term?
Well, listen, keeping your fingers crossed is never a great strategy, but I've got mine crossed right now because I have no idea what the outcome of this is going to be, something that's going to be impactful for all of us. So we'll keep an eye on this and we'll come back to this one again in our next recording. I say to all our viewers, thank you very much again for tuning in. As always, please do like, subscribe, and maybe even give us a thumbs up, and we'll be back with you again very soon.